The Finance Committee will come to order. This is our third hearing of the week, and the attendance among members has been terrific on both sides of the aisle. And I see Senator Crapo here, and I appreciate all his efforts to get members on both sides involved. This morning, we're going to focus on the issue of forced labor. We understand in our country, we have a lot of economic and political muscle, and our country should use that muscle to fight for American jobs and our workers. It should also use that muscle wherever possible to improve the lives of powerless people around the world. It's not every day you have an opportunity to talk about accomplishing both of those goals at once. Today is one of those days with the Finance Committee meeting to discuss stamping out forced labor, which is modern day slavery around the globe. Now, it's going to take hard work, even in 2021, to live up to a moral standard that says the U.S. will not profit from slave labor, and yet it still goes on in many places around the world, including in places that are part of our global supply chains. The hard work, though, to fight forced labor is absolutely essential. Our government ought to use every available tool to root out the practice of forced labor and address its causes. That includes diplomacy, efforts to alleviate poverty, sanctions, or any other means. Within the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, the government has to use every tool in the trade toolbox to keep forced labor products out of our market. The federal ban on imports made with forced labor goes back to 1930. It's known in trade law as Section 307. It gives customs the authority to stop products made with forced labor. However, there is a loophole in that federal ban that applied to products that aren't made within the United States, and it persisted for decades. Senator Brown, who has led on this issue for years, he and I wrote an amendment that closed the forced labor loophole in 2016. Since then, enforcement actions have increased, but so have glaring examples of the scourge of forced labor, especially in China. 2 U.S. administrations have now concluded that what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs people in the Xinjiang region in Western China constitutes genocide. The Chinese government and Chinese companies are using forced labor from that region to produce a variety of products. For example, the U.S. took action to block the import of cotton and tomatoes picked by slave labor in Xinjiang. The Finance Committee is going to hear today from Joseph Rona, whose good-paying union job is in the production of silicon metal, was shut down in part due to forced labor competition from China. Forced labor is a problem in other countries too, including in India, Burma, and Malaysia. As I indicated, Senator Brown and I have been pushing for U.S. trade enforcers to do work on a variety of fronts, including taking action against the import of mica, palm oil, and cocoa produced with forced labor. Bottom line, the continued existence of forced labor is morally repugnant, and when American workers have to compete with forced labor, everybody loses. We want to make sure that the Customs and Border Patrol has the tools and resources it needs to step up enforcement. And like so much of what we're doing, this is another crucial area for bipartisanship. Ending forced labor is morally just. Raising the bar for labor standards around the world will help protect high-skill, high-wage jobs here in the United States. So this is an important hearing. We look forward to our witnesses. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing. The International Labor Organization estimates nearly 25 million people in the world are victims of forced labor. The criminals behind this tragedy reap nearly $150 billion in profits every year. As horrifying as that is, nearly 30% of the victims are also victims of forced sexual exploitation and generate 99 billion, or 2/3 of those profits that I just referenced. The fight against forced labor is not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. It is an issue that unites all Americans. That is critical to remember. Americans, including consumers, workers, and businesses, are all committed to this fight and doing everything possible to combat this scourge. The problem lies not with them, but with foreign autocrats and individuals who lack all sense of basic humanity. Our fight is with them. For example, as the chairman just mentioned, China's government has pressed nearly 100,000 Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities into forced labor, while euphemistically calling it poverty alleviation. As the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy explained in a report last week, China's treatment of the Uyghurs meets every criteria of genocide under the United Nations Genocide Convention. That report's findings, joint declarations by foreign legislatures, including Canada and the Netherlands, and track with a similar determination made by the State Department during the Trump administration. Accordingly, senators like Marco Rubio and Jeff Merkley, and many others, are showing leadership on this issue through their proposed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Their efforts should be matched by the current administration. The U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor are meeting today in Alaska with their Chinese counterparts. Forced labor is among the rights issues they need to press with them. Critically, this all reinforces that we need to broadly empower Americans and other good citizens of the world to be able to more effectively respond to this challenge. This includes effectively utilizing technology to identify where goods made with forced labor can enter the supply chain. It means our laws and regulations must be transparent and provide informative and thoughtful guidance so Americans know how to avoid importing such goods. It means we need to know the ongoing efforts of our businesses so that government can help leverage them in the fight against forced labor. Many of them have developed best practices to stamp out forced labor from their supply chains. We need to leverage their experience and expertise. Finally, it means we must partner with civil society to raise awareness on this important issue. The witnesses we have today can speak to each of these points. Their expertise and knowledge will help this committee address this important matter. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad this is an issue which we both care deeply about, and thank you for organizing this hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses.
Thank you very much, Senator Crapo. Let me now introduce our witnesses. Mr. Joseph Arona, Buffalo, New York, is a United Steelworkers member. He's a former employee of Globe Specialty Metals, and they produce a critical input for semiconductor chips and solar panels, and they're based in Niagara Falls, New York. Globe Specialty Metals shuttered its factory in 2018 due to intense competition from underpriced Chinese products, as well as shifts in global demand, driven in part by Chinese product that was produced with forced labor. He now works for another firm. Ms. Martina Vandenberg will be next of Washington, D.C., the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, an important organization established in 2012. She's a non-governmental organization dedicated to the eradication of forced labor. Ms. Julia Hughes of Washington, D.C. is president of the United States Fashion Industry Association that represents brands and retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the United States that do business globally. And Dr. Leonardo Bonanni is of New York, is the founder and CEO of SourceMap, a supply chain transparency company, and they track the supply chains of more than 50 raw materials. And we welcome all of them, and we're going to make your prepared remarks a part of the record. And let's begin with you, Mr. Rona.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee. My name is Joe Rona, and I am a member of the United Steelworkers and a maintenance mechanic at Sumitomo Tire Plant in Tonawanda, New York. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the important topic of how to fight forced labor and improve our supply chains. Connecting my life in Buffalo to global supply chains and forced labor is unfortunately and surprisingly too straightforward. While I've worked at the tire plant for the last couple years, my previous job was at Faro Globe's Niagara Falls, New York plant. I worked there for 10 years, roughly with 100 other union members and management. The Faro Globe facility, which I'll call Globe, used to produce metal silicate by taking quartz, wood chips, and coal and cooking them in an electric arc furnace until the quartz is reduced into silicon metal. Metal silicate is a product that we made 24/7 at the plant. It is a product you interact with every day in a variety of ways, from strengthening aluminum to the caulking that seals your home, or even cosmetics. Silicon metal is everywhere. It is also a base component to the production of polysilicon, which is vital to solar panel production. Expecting that strong demand for solar power would boost metal silicate demand, in 2009, Globe planned a $35 million upgrade to convert its metallurgical grade silicon into 4,000 tons of upgraded metallurgical grade silicon each year, enough to produce 500 megawatts of solar power. Our company, in an investor report in 2016, highlighted the opportunity to see demand grow as Solar City, a solar panel company connected to Elon Musk, was supposedly in the final stages of construction. However, that vision fell apart for the workers at Globe in 2018 when the plant was closed because of lack of demand. Globe has been fighting illegal trade practices in metal silicate for decades now. The first trade enforcement case against dumped and subsidized metal silicate from China started 30 years ago in 1991. But while tariffs on metal silicate helped to defend our jobs at Globe, they could not stop products further up the supply chain like solar panels or those produced with forced labor. The growth of China's industrial capacity is well documented. Chinese companies in polysilicon produced over 80% of global polysilicon in 2020. This has effectively locked out U.S. out of growing solar demand, and overcapacity in China destroys nearly any ability of U.S. companies to compete. But for my brothers and sisters who made good wages at Globe, between $70,000 and $100,000 a year, were victims not only to unfair trade practices, but also forced labor in China. About 45% of the world's supply of solar-grade polysilicon comes from Xinjiang. The news about human rights abuses there are unacceptable. According to academic experts, 10 million Muslim minorities in the region are under lockdown control, and over 1 million Uyghurs and others have allegedly disappeared into internment camps. One study estimates that more than 80,000 Uyghurs were transferred out of Xinjiang to work in factories across China between 2017 and 2019. There should be no debate. Eliminating forced labor from our country's supply chain should happen today, and companies who have benefited should be held accountable. It was a good step when Customs and Border Patrol issued a withhold release order against cotton and tomato products produced by Uyghurs. We should act immediately to do the same for products like solar panels that contaminate the supply chain with forced labor. We also need to act urgently to defend American workers and foster a domestic solar industry here. This means direct investment in metal silicate plants like my old facility in Niagara Falls or the plant in Alloy, West Virginia, where my union brothers and sisters work. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Finally, working with my union, I've included additional materials with my written testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rona. We'll next have Ms. Vandenberg.
Thank you so much, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members. It is an honor to appear before you today to address the issue of forced labor in global supply chains and the Tariff Act. I lead the Human Trafficking Legal Center, a human rights organization dedicated to the eradication of forced labor. In 2020, we joined a coalition of non-governmental organizations to petition Customs and Border Protection to block all imports of Xinjiang cotton into the United States. CBP issued a region-wide withhold release order in January 2021. China has been much of the focus of CBP enforcement, but forced labor is a global issue. We once assumed that we could prosecute our way out of forced labor, but we were wrong. Prosecutions are practically non-existent. According to the State Department's 2020 Trafficking in Persons report, There were just 1,024 forced labor prosecutions in the entire world in 2019. And the United States is no exception. According to the Department of Justice, federal prosecutors indicted just 12 forced labor cases in the entire country in fiscal year 2019. And although extraterritorial jurisdiction has existed since 2008 to prosecute forced labor cases in global supply chains, federal prosecutors have never brought even one forced labor supply chain case that invoked extraterritorial jurisdiction. So what is the result of this enforcement vacuum? Impunity, complacency, and immense human suffering. We now live in a world in which migrant workers must pay for their jobs. They must buy their jobs. They do not pay to play, workers pay to work. And because they cannot afford to pay the recruitment fees outright, workers must borrow. Many find themselves trapped in forced labor and debt bondage. And until recently, these workers had few remedies. The closing of the US Tariff Act's consumptive demand loophole in 2016 changed the game. That move catapulted Section 307 from a moribund statutory relic to a valuable tool to combat forced labor. We still have a long way to go. We can analogize to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In the 1970s, bribery was ubiquitous, just as forced labor is today. That all changed when the Department of Labor started prosecuting companies and individuals under the FCPA. Suddenly, bribery allegations went straight to the C-suite. So what had changed? It was risk, the advent of risk. We are a long way from FCPA anti-bribery enforcement levels for forced labor. But Customs and Border Protection's Section 307 enforcement under the Tariff Act is bringing us closer. According to data recently released by CBP, in the first quarter of FY 2021 through December 31st last year, the government detained 90 shipments of cargo covered under different WROs. The value of that cargo was $20.8 million. In FY 2020, CBP detained a total of 324 shipments valued at $55 million. So it looks like CBP is poised to shatter the FY 2020 detention record, which is a welcome development. So we applaud this progress, but there are gaps. Issuing a WRO is only the first step. Robust and swift enforcement must follow. CBP announced that despite the region-wide WRO on all Xinjiang cotton, the agency would focus only on direct imports from the region. The agency termed this a scalpel approach to enforcement. We believe that this is inadequate. The WRO should be enforced broadly. And we also see now a backlash against Tariff Act enforcement, with lawsuits filed by corporations against non-governmental organizations and researchers. These retaliatory legal actions have a chilling effect on NGOs, which we can only surmise is their intent. Sim Darby, a Malaysian palm oil producer subject to a WRO, filed a lawsuit in US federal court against the director of Liberty Shared, seeking extensive discovery of confidential investigation materials. And Chinese corporations have filed a suit in China against Adrian Zentz, a US-based human rights researcher who has documented widespread forced labor in Xinjiang. Facing universal outrage, Sim Darby dropped their lawsuit just a week after filing. But increasingly loud corporate voices seek to dismantle Section 307's enforcement regime. Couched in the language of calls for due process, these critics come to bury Section 307, not to praise it. My written testimony has extensive recommendations, but I will focus on just 4. Number 1, include workers and unions in all remediation plans. CBP should ensure that effective workers and their unions have a role in enforcement and remediation. Create emergency worker funds for workers harmed by WROs. Punish companies that retaliate against workers or petitioners. Disclose shipments detained under a WRO. CBP should also release enforcement updates on each WRO each quarter. Forced labor is a feature, not a bug, in global supply chains. There should be no safe harbor for goods made with forced labor anywhere in the world. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Very good. Next will be Ms. Hughes.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. I thank you for the invitation to appear today. I'm president of the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, and I appreciate the chance to talk about the industry and the fight against forced labor and how to improve enforcement to reach our shared goal of the elimination of forced labor. A little background about USFIA. We represent apparel brands, retailers, importers, and wholesalers based in the United States and doing business globally, including many of the iconic brands worn and loved by everyone participating in this hearing. Global trade and ethically sourced trade is essential for American brands and retailers to be successful and reach consumers around the world. Because we are a global industry, we know that forced labor exists in many parts of the world. For several decades, USFIA member companies have maintained codes of conduct and strict requirements for supply chain partners that ban the use of forced labor. Companies maintain an extensive network of contracts, audits, verifications, training, and direct engagement with suppliers. But we recognize that there remains more action needed to guarantee that forced labor is not in the supply chain for fashion products. So what are we doing to root out forced labor from the supply chain? Even before the very public media reports about forced labor in the past year, our industry associations, USFIA, working with our friends at the American Apparel and Footwear Association, National Retail Federation, and Retail Industry Leaders Association, joined together to create an ad hoc forced labor working group to facilitate the sharing of information and the sharing of resources among the industry. The task is not easy, to put it mildly. My personal belief is that to eliminate forced labor, we need to go beyond what companies can do on their own and go beyond an emphasis on punitive measures to use multi-stakeholder approaches. The combination of civil society, NGOs, companies, governments, and international institutions is needed to reach our goal. In the written statement, I shared a few examples of how this has worked. I'm especially pleased to mention the Cotton Campaign, which for more than a decade, brands and retailers have been a part of, focused on eliminating the government-sanctioned use of forced labor in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan. And today, moving forward with reasonable, responsible sourcing agreements with cotton growers, cooperatives, and brands looking to the future. Another approach that is just at the beginning is the Yes Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced. This is an initiative to eliminate forced labor with a pilot program based on OECD due diligence guidance that has wide industry support. There also are pilot programs recently funded by the Department of Labor that will focus on developing solutions to forced labor that bring together technology tracking in the supply chain. An award to Verite that will support a project based in India, Elevate that will be looking at supply chains for cotton in Pakistan, and cobalt in the DRC. But even with all these initiatives, we know we need more, and we need to work with the executive branch and with the Congress to eliminate forced labor. In my remaining time, I just want to briefly focus on the executive branch aspect. We support a coordinated effort to engage our trading partners to eradicate forced labor from the supply chain, working together with the State Department, U.S. Trade Representative's Office, Labor, Commerce, NSC, USTA, to make this a priority for a whole of government approach. We especially want to talk about the important role of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to implement this enforcement strategy. U.S. companies are partners with CBP on enforcement, the policy of informed compliance, the participation of companies in CBP's trusted trader programs means there already is a shared approach to enforcement. What we believe will help even more is more transparency in the process and more of a shared approach. What does that mean in practice? 2 recent GAO reports highlighted some of the issues, and it boils down to transparency and objective criteria are essential for success. We don't think success is measured by the number of detentions. Success will be measured by the degree to which we all work together to effectively reduce and eliminate forced labor around the world. Transparency is key for this. We hope to work with CBP and the committee, and I thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. Fashion brands and retailers have zero tolerance for forced labor. We believe working together to eradicate forced labor from global supply chains will be good for American workers, American consumers, and the world, and we stand ready to work with members of the committee and the Congress to achieve this goal.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hughes. Mr. Bonini.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm the founder and CEO of SourceMap, a leading provider of technology for supply chain transparency. As this committee has underscored in bipartisan fashion, forced labor is endemic to many supply chains. At the same time, no company can afford to audit every supplier every day. Business needs a scalable solution. I founded SourceMap at MIT with the goal of leveraging the reach of the internet to monitor global supply chains to a degree that was never before possible. Let me describe how it works. First, we set up a unique social network to help companies identify all of the actors in their supply chain, down to the names and addresses of every mine, every farm, every factory, and every warehouse. Second, companies use this network to regularly collect data from all of the actors in the supply chain, which our software then analyzes to detect patterns that indicate the presence of forced labor. We can even collect data in remote supply chains where there is little to no internet access using a smartphone app that works online and offline. Third, and most importantly, we never take the information that has been provided at face value. Instead, we continuously analyze data from suppliers for errors and omissions, for patterns of fraud, waste, and abuse. To do this, we use the best available techniques, including satellite imagery, mobile device tracking, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. The demand for this level of supply chain transparency is growing. SourceMap is used today by some of the largest companies in the US, companies responsible for tens of billions of dollars in US imports. Thousands of their suppliers log into SourceMap from every corner of the globe to share extensive information on their supply chains. And that's because supply chain transparency is a very small price to pay for access to the US market. For the first time in the history of globalization, companies can have a map of their global supply chain that's verified and up to date. It's not transparency for transparency's sake. This map is the foundation for identifying and remediating forced labor in the end-to-end supply chain, so that one day every container arriving in the US can have a clean bill of health. Is it a panacea? No, but it represents a step change in the degree of supply chain transparency businesses and governments can expect in support of their ongoing fight against forced labor. Mr. Chairman, supply chain transparency is good for business in many other ways. It reduces risk, it saves money, it helps to secure hard-to-get materials, it helps to monitor for quality, counterfeiting, environmental conditions, health and safety. This committee has an important role to play. This hearing itself sends a message that you expect action from all stakeholders. Mr. Chairman, I know that you've been working with Senator Brown on new tools to empower Customs and Border Protection. I encourage you to put supply chain transparency technology at the center of those efforts. Supply chain transparency needs to become the norm. At a minimum, companies should disclose the names and addresses of their direct and indirect suppliers. This evidentiary standard will establish the US as the leader in combating forced labor in supply chains, while saving companies and customs protection millions of dollars. Setting a simple standard for supply chain transparency will help create a level playing field for all companies importing goods into the US. It's not just the right thing to do for our values, it's the smart thing to do for US business and for US workers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bonini. I think you set a land speed record for impressive content delivered very quickly. Now, let me start with you, Mr. Arona, because I think I want to ask the question that really frames this whole discussion. To what extent did imports produced by forced labor contribute to your plant closing and you and your coworkers losing your jobs?
To what extent did it affect all of us?
Yeah.
Well, we lost our jobs. We lost our livelihood. We have rent to pay, mortgage to pay, car payments, food, college. And these jobs in Western New York are not that easy to fill or replace, I should say.
I asked it the way I did because I wanted to give you a chance to really lay out, as you did, just how serious the consequences were. I was looking at the record and I thought, well, maybe there'd be other factors, but you basically said that imports produced by forced labor was the ball game. That's what took that livelihood away from you. Is that right?
Yes, we can't. as American companies or employees compete with that.
Great. Let me go on to you, Ms. Vandenberg. You said that an increase in Customs and Border Patrol forced labor investigations and enforcement since 2016 was helpful, that there was an increase, and it took place when Congress closed the loophole in the forced labor ban. While this is obviously progress, speak, if you would, to the scope of the problem that remains and the difficulties in obtaining sufficient evidence for Customs and Border Patrol to issue additional withhold release orders.
So the scope of the problem is enormous, and I want to thank you for your leadership and Senator Brown for his leadership in closing the loophole. It has made an enormous difference. As Senator Crapo pointed out in his opening remarks, the ILO estimates that there are more than 25 million people held in forced labor around the globe. So we are barely touching the surface of the problem here. In terms of evidence provided by to CBP, this is an enormous problem, and we would like to see more self-initiated investigations by Customs and Border Protection. At this point, non-governmental organizations send in petitions to Customs and Border Protection requesting withhold release orders. It requires enormous effort by these non-governmental organizations. It requires enormous risk as well, with witnesses on the ground providing testimony of forced labor, many of them in fear of retaliation. So I don't think that the system is perfect. We have a lot of work to do on this, but we are delighted to see additional enforcement.
Good. Ms. Hughes, a question for you. The customs statute charges importers to exercise reasonable care to comply with customs requirements when importing goods. And I guess there is a kind of process, a risk management process that your members take to make sure that they are exercising reasonable care. Could you just briefly touch on that?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. And absolutely, brands and retailers, this, by the way, is not just since TIFTIA and the change in Section 307, but long before that, have had a extensive process of audits and investigations and review of documents, because we know we're the ones on the ground, we're on the front lines, to make sure that we can, if we see a problem, that companies will take the care that is needed and be able to show what they have done to remediate, if remediation is possible. And if remediation is not possible, then of course companies will take action to cut ties.
Okay. I just want to give a quick kind of summary of what this first panel really has, outlined. To me, Mr. Arona was very, very blunt, and he made it clear that imports produced by forced labor was the ball game when it came to destroying the livelihood that he and his colleagues enjoyed. And Ms. Vandenberg said we better up the enforcement efforts, and Ms. Hughes said the private sector wants to cooperate. And to me, what it tells me as we start this discussion is protecting American jobs against imports made with forced labor, and still going to bat for workers exploited around the world are not mutually exclusive. We can save the jobs of people like Mr. Rona, and we can help address exploitation around the world. And we've got a lot of colleagues interested in this issue, and we have a new administration, and it's time to step up our game and do the work you're talking about. And I thank our excellent first panel. We're now going to turn to Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'll go first to you, Ms. Hughes. As I alluded in my opening statement, U.S. businesses are partners in combating forced labor. It seems imperative to me that Customs and Border Protection should develop an enforcement strategy that works with reliable American businesses to focus on unscrupulous actors. What elements would you look for in such a strategy?
Thank you so much for that question. And I think that is at the heart of the discussion today. first, we're looking for more transparency. We want to be partners with CBP, particularly those companies who are trusted traders and have already been fully vetted and provided extensive details about their supply chain to Customs and Border Protection. We think that we can do more working together than working separately and looking at enforcement actions, but not the real actions that will get to the perpetrators of the crime, which is not the US companies that are good corporate citizens.
Thank you. And continuing on that line, some of the businesses in your association have developed supplier codes of conduct.
Yes.
Some of them rely on international instruments like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some of them, the International Labor Organization's conventions. And it's positive that American companies are striving for these high ethical standards. My question is, what do you view as some of the minimum elements that an effective code of conduct should contain, and what can CBP do to help reinforce those efforts?
Thank you so much. Well, the basic is no forced labor in our supply chain, period. And there's no question that in the code of conduct for every company, that is a basic. But how can CBP work with us on this? Part of that is sharing of information so that when they have gathered information, as other speakers have mentioned, and we have gathered information, that we can share that information together to focus on eliminating the practices that already exist.
Well, thank you. And that leads to a question for you, Dr. Benani. It appears that we are actually underutilizing the potential of technology in combating forced labor imports. What can be done at CBP to expedite the adoption of new technologies?
That's right, Ranking Member Crapo. We're fighting these bad actors with technology from the last century. And rather than use such blunt instruments as banning imports from an area, we need to move towards the real use of supply chain transparency technology, which many of industry members are already using today. What I mean by that is we need to grow the scale at which customs can enforce these issues. Remember, it's not just the areas that have been identified as being at high risk of forced labor, because as soon as an area has been identified that way, the bad actors will try to move the products to areas that are considered low risk. And so we need to have transparency on both those high risk and low risk sourcing areas to make sure that we can stamp out forced labor and any path that it might take to market. I would also urge customs to set a very simple standard for the kind of company data that should be collected so that companies can confidently import goods into the country. And then I know I've only had a little bit of time to explain what is a relatively complicated technology to address a very complex problem, but we are very open and in fact already working with the government, including having been selected to provide traceability for the Department of Labor's recent project to trace goods of child labor in India. And so I welcome your questions, but also further questions from the committee on how we can help to set that data standard and really go big so that all of the companies are pushing transparency to the same degree and tackling the problem together.
Well, thank you. And Ms. Vandenberg, I've read that your research indicates that many countries lack the political will to criminally prosecute forced labor. That is deeply troubling. It is simply not enough to stop goods made with forced labor from entering the United States. Forced labor is a crime against humanity and perpetrators must be punished. What can we do to incentivize countries to bring such prosecutions?
That's an excellent question, but I think we need to start at home. I think it's highly troubling that the United States has not brought any cases whatsoever invoking extraterritorial jurisdiction to prosecute global supply chain forced labor in the US federal courts. And what we've seen instead are civil cases brought by plaintiffs and victims themselves in US courts using strategic litigation. I think that the Trafficking in Persons report issued by the State Department should focus very deeply on the failure to prosecute forced labor around the world. It does now, but I think it should emphasize that even more.
All right, thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My colleague, Senator Cantwell, is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Still appreciate the hearing. The United States Department of Justice-led Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking and Fishing in International Waters issued a report in just this January. It made specific recommendations about combating forced labor and fishing on the high seas. The U.S. government promoted the industry effort to help due diligence in global supply chain, and among other actions, the task force reported that they recommend strengthening the capacity to collect, fuse, and analyze data from multiple sources to human trafficking in international waters. And it notes that more data from the fishing industry regarding this issue of human trafficking or the risk of it would be useful. And I fully agree with that. I want to ask Mr. Bonani if technology he thinks might help in the traceability of the seafood problem or promote more transparency so that we could use that on a global scale. And I would also like to ask Ms. Vandenberg if she could comment on Customs and Border Patrol in enforcing laws to prevent seafood and other products tainted by forced labor from entering the United States.
Thank you, Senator. The problems you describe are tragic and occur in that industry on a huge scale. There is absolutely the need, let's say, to install the same kind of tracking that we do for land-based industries, factories, warehouses, mines, farms. There is absolutely the need to install that technology on fishing vessels and to track them because of the fact that they, in fact, can operate extra jurisdictionally. And so I would urge that the same traceability approaches that we've seen the leaders of industry implement today for land-based assets be deployed and be part of the required tracking of vessels, which is required for many other reasons. And I would urge that we do it under the same auspices as one of the other programs that we support that Customs has in place, the Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, so-called CTPAT, which again, for the same reasons, uses and mandates a level of tracking and tracing of goods for a different reason, but the same technology could be used in this way to ensure the abolition of forced labor on fishing vessels.
So Customs and Border Patrol should take the lead on that?
I'm not versed in policy well enough to tell you that.
Okay. All right, Ms. Vandenberg.
Yes, Senator Cantwell, thank you for that question. CBP has very actively enforced WROs on individual fishing vessels, looking largely at long-line tuna fishing vessels flagged in Taiwan. Many of those petitions have been put in by Greenpeace. The problem that we have is that the Seafood Import Management Program, SIMP, which tracks seafood coming into the United States, only covers 13 varieties of fish and seafood. That's only about 40% coming into the United States. I have to admit, we are way behind the Europeans because Europe at this point tracks 100% of seafood coming into their markets. And so we would strongly suggest that Congress increase the scope of the Seafood Import Management Program run by NOAA so that it covers all seafood coming in. One of the great problems that we have as NGOs filing petitions with CBP is that we don't have just to file evidence of forced labor. We also have to show that it's coming into the US market, which without seafood tracing at 100% level is extremely difficult. Thank you.
And so how are the Europeans doing it? You're just saying they put the resource behind it?
I do think that this is a resources issue, and a number of NGOs that focus on fishing and illegal fishing have suggested that this program, the SIMP program, could be extended with just additional resources here in the United States.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I really do believe, as we've said at other hearings related to USMCA and others, that capacity building and enforcement go hand in hand. So if we don't have the capacity, and so we'll certainly work at this, we'll take that charge back to NOAA. And is there anything else they need to do with Customs and Border in a resource way, or the Coast Guard to make this work?
I do think that there's a problem with interagency communication and interagency cooperation. And so we would push very hard for Customs and Border Protection to work more closely with DLO, with Department of Labor and with ILAB. They are already working with NOAA. So I think there's progress. The limitation is in the number of seafood varieties that are tracked.
Okay, well, let's get them all tracked. So anyway, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell, and it's important for the country, and it's especially important for the people who give us an election certificate in the Pacific Northwest, and I thank you for doing that. Next will be Senator Grassley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. We need fairness in our trade, and we need a level playing field, and you're hitting that very hard with this hearing. I want to lead into a question with Ms. Hughes this way. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute in January last year said around 600 ethnic minority workers from Xinjiang were employed at a shoe manufacturer whose primary customer is Nike. These workers were mostly Uyghur women who at night were required to study Mandarin and sing Chinese national anthem. New evidence from a Nankai report, a Chinese academic publication with information from public government sources show that the primary aim of what the Chinese call labor transfers are not economic but political and demographic. The report, which was made public in English by the Victims Communism Memorial Foundation, details the state's campaign of cultural and demographic genocide. In your testimony, you said you want to look at the role of the U.S. CBP to implement enforcement so that no products with forced labor reach the United States. So my question, would you be supportive of holding companies accountable by having the Customs Border Patrol issue withhold release orders on products that were manufactured with forced labor?
Thank you very much for the question. Obviously, this is one of the most critical issues facing us today when we talk about forced labor. And absolutely, speaking on behalf of the fashion industry and all of the products, there is no room for forced labor in our supply chains. And we did not oppose the withhold release order on products from XPCC or products from the XUAR region that are made with forced labor. We recognize this is a critical issue. We've read the reports that have come out, and companies have responded strongly to that to eliminate any of those products from their supply chain to the best of their ability, meaning where they have the transparency in the supply chain, and continue to support those efforts. That's why we want to work closer with CBP, if we can, to eliminate the forced labor.
Can you speak to what American companies like Nike are doing to eliminate forced labor from their supply chains?
I wouldn't put myself forward to represent Nike because I know they can speak well for themselves. But what I do know is that companies such as Nike and many other of the global brands and retailers have already taken action in their supply chain. They have taken action, and we certainly can respond after the hearing with specifics, from the company level. But I'm very confident that they are not doing any business in the XUAR region, nor are the other brands and retailers that we represent.
Okay. To Mr. Banami, I'm going to skip a lead into your question and get immediately to the questions because time's running out. With the technology that you have developed at Source Map, are you able to know how many factories in China use forced labor from Uyghur Muslims? And I was talking about Uyghur Muslims in my opening, which I skipped to get time used efficiently.
Of course, thank you, Senator, and we all recognize how important this issue is. with our technology, we're able to provide the data to our customers, to leading brands in the US, importers, the data that they need to know whether they can confidently rely on a supplier, whether that supplier is direct or it's a supplier of a supplier or a supplier of a supplier of a supplier. The main issue we have when we're collecting data from Xinjiang is the lack of willingness to share. And for a company like us, we're a transparency platform. So as soon as there is no more transparency, then the risk becomes absolute. And our customers will typically choose to vote with their feet and look elsewhere for sourcing.
Okay, I got just 10 seconds left. So one other quick question. Are you able to track which goods were produced at factories using forced labor in China?
We are absolutely able to give our customers the confidence to know which factories have a very high chance of using forced labor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very, very good. Our next panel member will be Senator Menendez, and Senator Crapo is going to chair because I have to run to the Senate floor and speak briefly, and we thank Senator Crapo and recognize Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Vandenberg, in your testimony, you referenced a recent GAO report that found that as a result of a September 2019 order that blocked the importation of rubber gloves from Malaysian producers, many workers at the company were terminated, increasing their risks of further exploitation. We should all be able to agree that our enforcement of the laws against forced labor shouldn't have the perverse effect of making the victims of forced labor even more vulnerable. You suggest creating an emergency fund for workers to help mitigate these efforts. How do you envision that fund working, and what would be the best way to pay for it?
Thank you, Senator Menendez. You know, we've talked a lot today about withhold release orders. We haven't talked about fines and penalties because bringing goods made with forced labor into the United States is forbidden. The importers should be paying fines. Those fines should then be used to fund an emergency fund. There has been only one finding issued by Customs and Border Protection and only one penalty so far that has been initiated against the company. It was a $575,000 fine against Pure Circle for bringing in shipments of stevia, the artificial sweetener, that was subject to a withhold release order. So what we would like to see is that money go not to the Treasury and not to the general fund, but see that money go to an emergency fund for workers. The ability of us to create this emergency fund is really predicated on greater enforcement by CBP and higher fines. So that's the idea, but we look forward to working with you to put flesh on the bones of the proposal.
I appreciate you offering a potential solution. As we work to reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I look forward to working with you more on this idea and seeing if we can put it into action. In my role as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, we have been particularly focused on goods and services sourced from Xinjiang by U.S. companies, ranging from computer terminals and other high-tech goods to cotton used in the manufacturing of textiles and apparel. Last year, I wrote to then Commerce Secretary Ross asking him to establish clear and transparent standards of procurement and requirements for additional labor and human rights vetting for any goods or services that are manufactured in Xinjiang. My colleagues, Senator Merkley and Rubio, have introduced bipartisan legislation, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, that would do this and more, including authorizing the use of sanctions on individuals knowingly facilitating forced labor. And I look forward to having a markup of, in some form in the near future, of that type of approach. So let me ask Dr. Bonani, in your experience, how widespread is the problem of forced labor in Xinjiang, and are there are specific companies, big or small, that you have seen knowingly disregard human rights for the sake of profit?
You know, Senator, I think the extent of the problem is widely documented. In fact, companies come to us, to SourceMap, because they're looking to make completely certain that they're not buying anything from Xinjiang. I mean, but let me back up a little. There are 155 goods identified by the Department of Labor from 77 countries at risk of forced labor and child labor. So the problem extends far beyond Xinjiang, the neighboring regions, or even China as a country, and it needs to be tackled on a global basis, and not the least of which, The problem is, as soon as one region becomes marked as high risk, those goods will find their way to market through other regions. And so we have to apply the data collection, the transparency, as we call it, we have to apply it uniformly across supply chains, or else goods will find their way to market one way or another, and it'll be nearly impossible. And I do want to underscore the complexity here. A multinational company has thousands of suppliers, maybe tens of thousands, and they have not, by and large, identified all of the actors in their supply chain yet. So by setting a clear standard, what customs can do is make it very easy for companies to obtain that baseline level of visibility, to know who the actors are, not just direct, but indirect, and not just in high risk regions, but in low risk regions as well, where product is likely to be smuggled.
Question. When the Finance Committee was debating Trade Promotion Authority legislation in 2015, it passed my amendment that barred fast-track procedures for any trade agreement with a country on Tier 3 of the State Department's Trafficking in Persons report, which essentially are the countries whose governments don't expend even the minimum effort to fight forced labor or sex trafficking. Ms. Hughes and Ms. Vandenberg, how have these disciplines worked out so far, and how should we be looking to improve forced labor standards in future agreements?
Thank you so much. I'll go first. We think it's essential that those provisions are included in our trade agreements. We need the support from not just U.S. government, as we've been really focused on during the hearing, but also our international trading partners to eliminate forced labor in the supply chains. So we very much support that approach and look forward to continuing to work to that end.
And I would completely agree. It is our view that all trade agreements that are negotiated need to have provisions that ban the importation of goods made with forced labor. And the reason is clear why we need this. It's because goods brought into US markets that are blocked by a withhold release order can simply be transshipped. And we have evidence that goods are being transshipped to Canada and to other markets. And so all of the markets need to have this importation ban.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. I don't see another senator on camera right now. Senator Thune is next. Senator Thune, are you here? All right, I do see Senator Whitehouse. Senator Whitehouse, would you like to proceed?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, thank you, Senator Crapo, and our chairman for this hearing. And I want to thank Chairman Cantwell for her remarks and focus on fisheries. And I want to follow up on her questioning there. One of the things that we've been trying to do has been to get the US military to share its information better with our efforts at enforcement against pirate fishing in the open oceans. Our first effort to get the Navy to do this was met with the response that we should go pound sand. It was not their job. So we came back, and in the following NDAA got the Coast Guard roped into it. And there is a lot of information that the Navy and the Coast Guard have access to about the travel of ships on the high seas. So as we're dealing with NOAA, with the Department of Labor, and with the Border Protection, Customs and Border Protection folks on this, there's also this overlay of military and security intelligence that we should have. I want to thank the Pew Trusts and Vulcan and other groups who have been really active in this space. Vulcan describes what it calls a devastating and corrupt criminal conspiracy at the heart of the seafood industry. And it's not just a question of forced labor, it's a question of actual slavery. And of course, if you're shipping stuff illegally around the globe, it's just as easy to put arms or human trafficking victims or other contraband in with the fish as well. So cleaning up this abuse of the high seas, I think, is a real priority. And I wanted to ask Ms. Vandenberg what you see happening with this, how we can work better together to combine all of these different assets and eliminate for once and for all this problem. A lot of things like vehicle monitoring systems are useful at providing data, but that presupposes that the fishing vessel is legitimate enough to install a vessel monitoring system and not corrupt enough to flip it off as soon as it gets out of the territorial waters of its home country. And it's really pretty gross stuff. I mean, you got people living in cages, you got stories of people who, when they got sick, were thrown overboard because it was too much of a pain to go and get them treatment on shore. It's a pretty brutal criminal conspiracy out there, and I'm glad that Chairman Cantwell brought attention to it, and I hope we'll keep that as a focus on this. It combines all the worst elements of forced labor, slavery, piracy, and international crime. Ms. Vandenberg, your reaction.
Senator Whitehouse, I could not agree with you more. If you look at the reporting, for example, that's done by Ian Urbina and the publication of his book, The Outlaw Ocean, we are talking about modern day slavery on the high seas in a way that is outside the reach of law unless countries choose to prosecute. And so murders that are committed against workers and fishermen on these ships that are unpunished and are committed with total impunity. I would just add one footnote to your comment on the U.S. Coast Guard. Several years ago, we learned that fishermen had been handing notes to Coast Guard officers boarding vessels. Those notes said, "Please help me." We are not certain at this point what the Coast Guard's protocol is when a fisherman on a boat cries out and asks for help because they're being held in forced labor. So I would ask that the Coast Guard's protocol be clear about what they do and how the U.S. government will intervene when it finds forced labor on a vessel.
Well, under the new NDAA provisions that we got put in, they are going to have to do more reporting on this, and we'll be sure to add that to the questions that we have in our scrutiny of all of this. The only thing I'd add, Mr. Chairman, is that while they're not an outright pirate fleet, the Chinese fishing fleet is behaving in extraordinarily aggressive ways, both as regards crewing, picking people off of other countries and taking their papers and putting them into effective servitude, and in return, also in terms of violating other countries' sovereignty, and even in the case of one incident in Indonesia, sending a Chinese military vessel into Indonesian waters to forcibly take back from Indonesian coastal authorities a Chinese pirate fishing vessel that it had seized and was going to sink, having seized it. So it was basically an act of war, but the Indonesians don't want to tangle with the Chinese on that level. But in my trips, particularly with Senator McCain, across the Pacific region, country after country after country raised concerns and complaints about the improper pressure of the Chinese fishing fleet against their sovereignty. So I think it's an area where we can make some real friends in the region if we're seen as being active supporters. And I flag that for my colleagues, and thank you for recognizing me.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and those are very appropriate observations. Next will be Senator Cortez Masto, and I should also say to the other senators, I know we've got a lot of senators who are trying to shuffle a lot of actions today, but we need you to start coming back for the hearing. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crapo. Ms. Vandenberg, I'd like to start with you, and thank you for the conversation today. I so appreciate the good work that you have been doing, providing legal representation to survivors of human trafficking. This is an area that I have worked in previously as the Attorney General of the state of Nevada. As you mentioned in your testimony, federal prosecutors in the United States indicted just 12 forced labor cases in the entire country in fiscal year 2019. So what would you say are the biggest barriers that prevent traffickers from being prosecuted in the United States?
Focusing on the global supply chain piece, so on the international cases, I think that there has been a tremendous reluctance at the Department of Justice to use the extraterritorial jurisdiction tools that Congress delivered in 2008. I think that's partly a resources problem. I think that U.S. attorneys' offices are reluctant to spend the resources required to do international investigations. I think we need international investigators who are competent and trained to do the sort of investigations that would be required to bring these cases in U.S. federal court. Again, looking to the FCPA as an example, many of those cases are brought because companies self-report. Companies go to DOJ with evidence and white papers of their own and inform DOJ of bribes that have been paid before they get caught. We don't have that same tradition with forced labor. Forced labor is currently treated as just a corporate social responsibility issue, which is enormously problematic.
Yeah, I can't agree more with you. To me, any type of human trafficking, we need to aggressively enforce and make sure we're doing everything we can. And I just so appreciate you having this conversation. Let me ask you, with respect to forced labor, can you talk a little bit about how well the different federal departments and agencies have coordinated around this strategies and tactics to meet this common goal? What should we be doing in Congress to help facilitate if that is not happening?
I think that it's improving, and certainly the GAO has recommended increased interagency cooperation across the board. The issue that we have is that Customs and Border Protection, these investigations are criminal investigations. And so there are legitimate reasons why it's not possible to share all of the evidence. The increased cooperation that we are seeing and that we welcome is increased cooperation between Customs and Border Protection, ICE, and the Department of Justice. Because the end game here has to be prosecutions for forced labor and global supply chains. And so that criminal justice alliance is what will lead to those prosecutions.
And can you touch a little bit why prosecutions are so important? Just in general, for people to understand why does this make a difference?
On the forced labor side of the house, it sends an incredibly strong message that forced labor is not tolerated. Again, I have dealt with agents on forced labor cases where the agents have essentially poo-pooed the case and said, well, this is just a dispute between an employer and an employee. This is not worthy of federal attention. The reality here is that we have people who are facing threats of deportation, threats of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, in order to compel them to work. These cases are worthy of federal attention, and it will be a much greater deterrent if we can say to corporations and to perpetrators, if you commit these crimes, the US government will prosecute you.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member.
Thank you. And next we will have Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Senator Crapo. I thank Chairman Wyden for holding this hearing today. He and I have done a lot of work together to close the consumptive demand loophole in combat forced labor and child labor. I'm excited. This is the first hearing that the Finance Committee is doing in the trade space this year. I have two questions. According to a GAO report issued earlier this month, CBP has issued 29 withhold release orders since February 2016. 5 of them cover a type of good produced in a specific location or region, such as cotton in Xinjiang, China, which produces 80% of Chinese cotton for apparel production in China. Center for Global Policy issued a report that suggests more than 500,000 Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minority people in Xinjiang have been coerced into picking cotton. Chairman Wyden and I wrote to the previous administration urging them to do more to enforce the law and stop importing products made for state-sanctioned forced labor. We clearly must do more. Ms. Vandenberg, you've recommended we strengthen enforcement of the existing regional WRO on cotton and cotton products from Xinjiang. Can you elaborate on your recommendations, please?
Absolutely. And I work with a coalition of non-governmental organizations called the Tariff Act Advisory Group, and we have actually submitted concrete recommendations that I reference in my written testimony to CBP, encouraging them to robustly enforce region-wide WROs, and particularly the region-wide WRO on cotton and tomatoes in Xinjiang. So very specifically, just 3 points. Number one, there needs to be greater transparency. We don't have any insight at this point into shipments detained under the region-wide WRO that banned Xinjiang cotton and tomatoes. So we need more insight to see what's coming into the country. Secondly, this sort of very kind of narrow approach, looking only goods coming directly from Xinjiang, ignores the fact that has been raised in this hearing that goods will be transshipped not just to other countries, but also to other regions in China. So Brenda Smith of Customs and Border Protection's Trade Office has said herself that China itself tracks cotton down to the bale level. And so we need to also be tracking goods down to that level. The last point I would make is just to reference testimony from Scott Nova from the Worker Rights Consortium before the House Ways and Means Committee. He pointed out, and I think it is true, that at this point, companies should simply not be in Xinjiang. There is no reason to be there anymore. And this rebuttable presumption that goods coming from that region are made with forced labor, I think must stand.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vandenberg, and thank you for devoting your professional life to such important work. My other question is for Mr. Rona. Thank you for your advocacy on behalf of the organized labor and steelworkers. I wear a pen I've worn through most of my congressional career. It's a pen designed and stamped by the United Steelworkers. So thank you for that. One of the big themes to come across today's testimony is the need for additional transparency and better coordination among CBP, other government entities, and stakeholders. GAO's recommended CBP strengthen its communication with stakeholders and make a description of its WRO revocation and modification process publicly available. Several people today have recommended the CBP expand its collaboration and communication with other agencies like USTR, and we're thrilled with the 98-0 vote for the new trade rep, ILAB, and the State Department, as well as non-government organizations. So, Mr. Rona, my question for you: what additional transparency would help unions and other worker support organizations protect workers who find themselves at risk of or impacted by forced labor? And as you answer that, you asked to answer this question too: how does greater transparency around CBP decisions and ongoing investigations help protect workers at risk, as well as U.S. workers who are impacted by this?
So, Ron, to your first question, I'm a maintenance worker in a plant. I don't have that much knowledge on the transparency issue. But I do know that when I'm at work, if I have a job to do, it gets checked, whether by quality, by management, by whoever. So I think it should be our government's job to check everything that's coming into this country and stop products if it's from forced labor. And greater transparency will help stop illegal goods and keep corporations that are honest with their supply chains. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rona. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time. I appreciate it. Thanks for doing
Thank
this.
you, Senator Brown. And next is Senator Thune and then Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hughes, in your written testimony, you state that member companies of the Fashion Industry Association have made, and I quote, extensive progress toward removing links with forced labor in their supply chains. While forced labor is deeply wrong wherever it occurs, there is increasing evidence of Uyghur Muslims work in cotton fields and factories in the Xinjiang region of China. What actions have your member companies taken to help ensure the goods they're selling are not from forced labor in China? And what is the most important thing that the U.S. government can do to help, in your mind?
Thank you so much. I mean, I want to be very clear to the members of the committee that brands and retailers have taken action to not have any links to trade from the XUAR region and the Uyghurs. Even before the withhold release order was issued, it was clear from the information that was publicly available that there were problems and concerns in the region, and particularly with the pandemic, where there is no ability for anyone to actually visit a facility to look for themselves. I think it's clear companies have cut off those ties with the region. So what could we really use? I think the big takeaway from the hearing today is that more resources are needed overall for dealing with this issue. And for our industry in particular, we continue to look for more transparency, release of names of bad actors when we know who they are, release of best practices when we see those, what is working, which may be, tracking, transparency, technology solutions. More resources are definitely part of what we're looking for. And we look forward to working more with you in the committee.
Let me, just as a follow-up, talk a little bit about those withhold release orders against Chinese entities and this 9 of those labor allegations. In November, CBP issued a withhold release order on cotton products from Xinjiang and 43 shipments valued at more than $2 million. CBP is doing excellent work, but in the estimation, how can the withhold release order process be made more effective? And perhaps on a related theme, what new technologies should CBP be considering to detect where supply chains are most susceptible to forced labor? And Ms. Hughes, if you want to start with that, if others have comments, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I mean, when we look at the data for what had been detained, what you see is that those were obviously small shipments, probably from smaller producers. So we go back to CBP needs to work with the trusted traders, that is the companies that have already been vetted and provided that information on their supply chains, and be able to focus their energies more on the bad actors, the folks who are not part of trusted trader programs and are probably not the large importers to the United States. I think that is one way to kind of use the resources that we do have more effectively.
All right. Anybody else quickly on that?
I'd just like to add very briefly that we're very concerned about the process for modification and revocation of these WROs. It's not just their issuance, it's also how they are removed over time. And it's very important that workers be at the table to actually articulate and determine whether the remediation that the company claims it has done has actually been achieved. We're seeing repayments of recruitment fees being paid over a period of months rather than in lump sum, which basically means that workers are loaning corporations money, which is not acceptable. So workers really need to weigh in on the validity of remediation plans that are submitted.
Let me just quickly shift to the labor audits. There was a Wall Street Journal report in September that at least 5 auditing firms say they won't offer supply chain inspections in China's Xinjiang region. There was a U.S. government report last year stated that supply chain auditors have reportedly been detained, threatened, or stopped by Chinese authorities in the region. As American companies look at their supply chains, and are they finding it more difficult to find independent labor audit inspections in Xinjiang? And given the lack of access for independent auditors, how are companies adapting their supply chains from the area? And I only have about 20 seconds left.
If I can jump in just briefly, that's why companies aren't doing business in the region. If you can't audit, and we follow the example, for example, of Better Cotton Initiative or the Fair Labor Association, many of the organizations that our members work with, we're not doing business in the region for exactly that reason.
Okay. I see I'm out of time. I'd love to get others' comments on that, but maybe they could supply them for the record.
Very good.
Thank you.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And thank you for having this hearing. So the use of forced and trafficked labor in China and too many other places around the world ranks as one of the worst abuses of basic human rights. We have a moral obligation to stamp out these despicable violations and to protect workers regardless of where they are in the world. This is about our values, but it's also about consequences here at home. American consumers are unwittingly buying products made with forced labor at their local clothing stores. American workers are being placed in the impossible position of competing against forced labor and child labor. And big American corporations, which have spent decades moving jobs overseas, are taking advantage of forced labor to improve their profitability. Mr. Rona, are corporations doing enough themselves to scrutinize their own supply chains for forced labor?
No, I absolutely am not.
Well, that pretty much answers it. So let's talk about what corporations are doing. Apple, Nike, Coca-Cola, companies that are as American as apple pie, are just a few of the brands that are suspected of relying on suppliers that use forced labor. And they have spent huge amounts of money and deployed armies of lawyers and lobbyists trying to water down legislation that would make them take more responsibility for their supply chains. So, Mr. Rona, how do you reconcile these companies' actions with their strong public statements against forced labor? Do you, or let me ask it another way, do you think they're likely to take meaningful steps to clean up their supply chains voluntarily?
No, I don't think they will. That's why I believe the government has a role to protect American workers from forced labor. Corporations making voluntary, has talked about this for decades of forced labor. This topic was, my father brought this topic up when I was a teenager. We talk about it, and not a lot gets done about it. It needs to stop now.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your point about this has been going on for a long time and it's just more talk. You know, there's a lot we need to do across government to end forced labor, and it starts with holding corporations that profit from forced labor accountable. And that means corporations should not be allowed to hide behind cheap talk or opaque audit processes. They need to show us that their supply chains are clean and to face meaningful consequences if they are not. We also need to pass meaningful anti-corruption legislation to prevent corporate lobbyists from sabotaging efforts to put our core values ahead of corporate profits. Under no circumstances should our supply chain support the repression of workers' rights overseas or undercut workers' rights and workers' economic security here at home. It is long past time that corporations are held to account for their complicity in forced labor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Senator Warren. You and I both saw that Mr. Rona sets the all-time record for succinctness, and we have appreciated that.
And that's because there's no ambiguity on this point. As he said, we've been talking about that since we were all teenagers. We have understood this problem, and Mr. Rona's ready to go on it.
Well stated. Senator Carper, getting in his seat.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, if I, Tommy, can you hear me? Tommy, can you see me? There we go. Apologies to the WHO. First, thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. We appreciate the witnesses joining us as well. I want to, and we're here to discuss the challenges that we're facing when it comes to forced labor in our supply chain. Timely topic, and one that's important. Throughout my time in public service as treasurer, congressman, governor, and senator, naval officer before that, I tried to live by a few guiding principles. And some of those will sound familiar to all of you. One of those is golden rule, the idea that we ought to treat other people the way we want to be treated. And another one comes out of a Bible study later today. Barry Blacker, Senate chaplain, and always reminds those of us who show up. We have about 7 or 8 or 9 of us that show up, those who need the most help in the U.S. Senate. And he always reminds us of verse of scripture in Matthew 25 about the least of these, that we need to care for the least of these among us. And in order to live up to this, I think we have a moral obligation to those in need and can't turn a blind eye with respect to this obligation. I've been heartened to see that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has increased its forced labor enforcement actions, including, I'm told, nearly 30 withhold release orders in the past 5 years, 30 withhold orders in the past I guess it's the past 5 years. I know there's still a good deal more we can do to ensure that our laws preventing forced labor are not just words on a piece of paper, but they really are enforceable. This means working with a number of entities and federal agencies for one, the private sector businesses, large and small, non-government organizations, consumers alike, to increase transparency in our supply chains. A question, if I could, from Ms. Hughes and Ms. Vandenberg, can you share with us one or two recommendations for Customs and Border Patrol and how that agency, that entity can improve its communications with key stakeholders on forced labor, including industry and non-governmental organizations? Please, Ms. Hughes, Ms. Vandenberg.
Thank you very much. As I know I have said multiple times today, this is a critical way that brands and retailers can guarantee that we are maintaining clean supply chains and making sure that there is no forced labor in our supply chain. So we're specifically have been asking Customs and Border Protection, and we have been meeting with them regularly for additional transparency on the findings that they do have so that we're able to take action faster against the bad guys. And also to work with us to guarantee that there are the resources there's a lot of additional enforcement that we've talked about today, but we clearly need to beef up the resources that are available to CBP and to other agencies. So to deal with a global difficult issue like forced labor.
All right.
I would just add that communication has improved immensely, and CBP now meets with.
Over what period of time have you observed that?
In the last, I would say, year, they've started meeting with this NGO community quarterly. And what we'd like to see is much more informal back and forth. Some of that happens. I'll give you a good example. Greenpeace has done a great deal of work to get the withhold release orders on vessel level forced labor fishing vessels. Those vessel level withhold release orders, we believe, should be expanded to fleet level, so that forced labor on one vessel would actually infect the entire fleet, because it's probably going on throughout the fleet. So those kinds of communications with CBP, those informal communications, are extremely important. But it's also important for petitioners to know when CBP plans to take action on a petition. And it's also important for petitioners to know when CBP plans to revoke or modify a petition, so that we can see whether the remediation on the ground is adequate.
All right. One follow-up question, if I could. This deals with improving the release order process for Ms. Vandenberg, if you would. Recently, GAO, Government Accountability Office, issued several reports that concluded that CBP faces challenges implementing its withhold release order process. At this time, CBP, as far as I know, has not shared its criteria or process for revoking or modifying these withhold release orders. And although the number of forced labor investigations has risen in recent years, CBP has struggled to collect sufficient data to set performance standards. And my question, Ms. Menendez, in your view, how can these WRO, how can the WRO process be improved, and what additional resources might CBP need in order to bolster its enforcement authority?
So CBP has actually started releasing process documents and fact sheets on how the system works. But I do think that there is a need for additional resources to deal with the system-wide issues. And again, one of the things that we frequently say is that forced labor is a feature and not a bug. And so dealing with these issues as one-off attacks on individual bad guys isn't going to work. CBP needs to work with unions and with worker rights organizations in order to make sure that we are systemically eliminating forced labor.
Thank you, ma'am. I suspect my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. The next two in line are Senator Portman and Senator Casey. Senator Portman, are you there? Or if we don't hear from Senator Portman, we will go to Senator Casey and get Senator Portman later. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much, and I want to thank you for this hearing. I just have one question for Mr. Rona regarding some of the material covered today, but also referencing a hearing we had earlier this week. We had a hearing on Tuesday about the American competitiveness in the context of manufacturing.
And I know that your experience at Ferroglobe tells the other side of the story. That means illegal subsidies, forced labor, and overcapacity have been devastating for U.S. production and manufacturing. It's not simply a matter of providing better incentives. We've got to have strong, ironclad trade enforcement, because if we don't, and we'll continue to lose foundational industrial capacity. So we know in the United States we can make it here with good paying jobs, family wage jobs, 70,000 and up all the way to 100,000 or more. But we've heard a lot from this panel today, rightfully, on the impact of forced labor in foreign countries, but there are impacts here at home. Forced labor anywhere harms workers everywhere. Illegal subsidies anywhere harms workers everywhere. So whether it's forced labor or illegal subsidies, can you talk about the impact that this has had on you and your family when you lost your job because of forced labor?
Well, when that Globe and quite frankly, American Axle closed, it impacted my family, severely. I mean, I look at both of my children's student debt, that if these manufacturing factories were still here, their debt wouldn't be as substantial as it is, or at all.
And anything else you think we should know about how best to, what's the best policy here for us?
I think American workers and American companies that manufacture here, it needs to be a fair playing field. There's certain things we just can't compete with. I mean, not only cheap labor, but slave labor is impossible for anybody to compete with.
Yep. Level playing field. Well, I promise one question, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. Members have pretty hectic schedules, so we're going to go to Senator Young and then Senator Warner. And I hope others who would like to ask questions will let us know. Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. My home state of Indiana is the most manufacturing intensive state in the country and employs over 500,000 Hoosiers. Despite our excellence and success, we haven't been immune to job losses because of offshoring as companies seek cheap inputs from China. A supply chain that's dependent on China is plagued with a number of issues. Intellectual property theft, disruptions, and forced data transfer are among them. And unsurprisingly, China is guilty of using forced labor to facilitate this dependence on their inputs in our supply chain. Dr. Benani, in your testimony, you explain how your technology can help businesses identify the use of forced labor in their supply chains. What are some barriers that might prevent a company from seeking your services?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The real problem here is that there's not a clear standard across the board. So we have companies that have already gone to the trouble of mapping their supply chains down to the raw materials and have also extricated themselves from parts of the world where they felt the risk was simply too high to continue operating. However, the standard is not evenly distributed. Transparency is not the norm. It is still the exception. And companies today need to be aware that identifying the actors in the supply chain, monitoring them continuously, and rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse are totally doable. These are things that are being done. They've been done now for years. That's on the private sector side, on the technology side. On the Customs and Border Protection side, we just need a very clear standard for what kind of data do companies need to collect regularly and keep up to date and keep fraud free in order to be ensured that their shipments can enter the US and be confident that those shipments do not touch forced labor. And again, that standard needs to be applied across the board.
Sure. So you've indicated that's an appropriate role as you see it for the federal government. Customs and Border Patrol needs to come up with a coherent, inconsistent standard for the private sector. Are there other roles that the federal government should fill in deterring the use of inputs or products at the hands of forced labor, to your mind?
I think that it's very clear that the diplomatic pressure that the government applies is extraordinarily useful. It's essential to rooting out forced labor. But in order to apply it effectively, we're going to have to look at not just those goods that are traced to the XUAR. We're going to have to look at all factories that could be used to pass through goods from the XUAR. So the standard does need to be applied uniformly to effectively enact this diplomatic pressure. It also needs to look at other countries and other regions of China where these goods might be passing.
Very good. Well, relatedly, I'm working on a piece of legislation that, among other things, would require the disclosure of whether materials, goods, or services from areas such as Xinjiang were made utilizing forced labor. While I'm skeptical that we can ever trust the information provided by Chinese companies, do you believe that such disclosure requirements would be helpful at deterring the production and/or purchase of these goods?
Absolutely. Look, supply chain transparency is a new thing. Until just a few years ago, the technology did not exist to even implement it, right? How do you communicate effectively with thousands of suppliers upon tiers and tiers and tiers of supply? Now that that technology exists, now that we can monitor that data for accuracy, we can cross-reference, we can look at satellites, we can look at third-party databases, we can audit the auditors. There's a tremendous wealth of technology available to companies that want to do this and do it the right way.
And yes or no, if possible, would I be correct to assume that you would agree that public companies that make profits off the back of those enforced labor camps should be forced to disclose their utilization of supply chains that run through Xinjiang?
I think the disclosure of all suppliers, direct and indirect, should be a norm that all U.S. companies and all foreign companies doing business in the U.S. should be held to.
Okay, very good. I will be following up with some questions for the record to you, Doctor, about how blockchain technology can help tackle forced labor issues embedded within our global supply chain. Thank you so much.
Happy to work with you.
Thank you, Senator Young. We're going to go to Senator Warner and then Senator Cassidy. We're trying to go back and forth as much as possible. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. And I want to build on so many of my colleagues' comments, but I do want to make one thing as we talk about China, and I'm very concerned about forced labor. I'm very concerned about the situation with the Uyghurs. You and I serve on the Intelligence Committee, and we have raised concerns about China and technology and unfair competition in a series of areas. But I do think, and it's something I've tried to be sensitive to literally over the last couple of years, that when we talk about China, we constantly reference the fact that our beef is with the Communist Party of China. It is with the policies of Xi Jinping. It is not with the Chinese people. We stand with the Chinese people in Hong Kong who are trying to fight for freedoms. And too often, particularly as accentuated by the former administration, this kind of blasting of China has translated into anti-Asian American hate activities. So we see the tragedy that took place in Georgia yesterday. And I know from talking to my Asian American community, but particularly Chinese American community in Virginia, that it is important that we make this distinction about our beef being with the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping, which again has treated not only the Uyghurs, but I point to the people of Hong Kong. Ms. Vandenberg, can you talk a little bit about which kind of product lines where we're seeing Uyghurs in forced labor in our supply chains? Because I think there's a general perception that it is usually low-end textiles and other things, but I think it's proven not to be simply those lower-end industries.
You are absolutely correct, Senator Warner. It is across the board. It is high-end goods that are electronic goods that we have in our possession that we purchase. So it's high-end goods. It's also garments, also clothing that is either produced in Xinjiang or in other parts of China or in Vietnam and other countries where they export the cotton. So I think that cotton and tomatoes, that's a good start for the WRO, but this is so much broader than just those two categories.
I would agree with you. Matter of fact, there's been a recent report by the Horizon Advisory Group that has shown that in Xinjiang, a number of solar companies have actually located. We all want to move towards greater solar panel production, but when that production includes forced labor, we have to be of huge concern. And I simply, in the effort to try to also cede back time, I just want to make one last comment, Mr. Chairman. That is, I echo some of the concerns that Senator Young has raised. I think we need more transparency on the global supply chain. I think for a long time, we've looked at the lowering of the prices that have come from the global supply chain, but the opaqueness of that supply chain in this last year with COVID, we've seen the downsides of that supply chain. We've seen when we are dependent for the supply of our pharmaceuticals coming disproportionately, the raw materials coming from China. We've seen single points of failure. We've seen one of my concerns is that the Chinese Communist Party's economic model, whereby they allow competition in their domestic market, and some of that competition can be brought about by using forced labor. You always will then have a Chinese company win the Chinese domestic market, 75, 80% in the case of a Huawei. That translates into 20, 25% of the global market. And then when China can bring enormous economic heft behind that Chinese champion, it puts us at any company, American or otherwise, at an economic disadvantage. So I hope we can work on more transparency. I think Senator Young's got some good ideas around that global supply chain. But I do, and I'll close with this simply, that we need to go after forced labor, but I think it really is important that we note that our beef is with the Communist Party and their policies, not with the Chinese people. And for the first time, Mr. Chairman, ever, I may be yielding back 41 seconds.
And I very much share your view, Senator Warner, with respect to who the real beef is with. And it is not with people who are working hard and trying to play by the rules. It's with that government. So I thank you for that. We're now going with Senator Cassidy and then followed by Senator Portman. We're trying to go back and forth, but members, it's kind of getting hard to keep track of everybody. Senator Cassidy.
Hey, Mr. Bonanni, thank you for being here. I'm very interested. Senator Young finished up by mentioning blockchain. It does seem like a distributed public ledger would help us follow many things. Can you comment upon its potential usefulness in this situation?
Senator, thanks for the question. I absolutely think there are many places where a distributed ledger could be extremely effective and help to standardize exactly what I was talking about in my testimony, which is that disclosure of suppliers in the supply chain uniformly for high risk and low risk regions alike. I will say that our company specializes in tracing supply chains from the retail all the way back to a small farm or even our artisanal mine. And so operations that are completely off the grid, sometimes record keeping only done on paper, if at all. And we do need to look at a suite of technologies that does not leave out those parts of the supply chain where implementing a distributed ledger would right now represent a barrier to entry. We need a solution, and we have solutions that have been proven to work, and they work today for monitoring forced labor, even in contexts where until recently all record keeping was done on paper. So while there is a place for blockchain, there is also a place for general use of the cloud and mobile technology, especially in emerging markets where smartphone adoption is taking off.
Gotcha. Now, let me just explore that a little bit, because I was so pleased Senator Young spoke to that, because I've been thinking about it as well. Recognizing what you say, that from the factory door back down to the small farm, you need a different mechanism. But from that factory door all the way to the end retailer, it may be that a distributed ledger works. And just for the context, we know that all the parties are able to look at the ledger and they can monitor whether or not something has been done appropriately or not, and if there's an alteration or an attempt to forge a record to make it appear different than it really is, or at least as it was originally posted. Is that a fair kind of a summary of the potential of the technology?
You know, the technology has that potential. I do want to caution the ways that it's used are very subtle, and some of that data, of course, cannot be shared in a public blockchain because of antitrust concerns. So there's a great deal of data that will have to be collected using existing techniques and technologies. I also want to add that once something is in the blockchain, it may not be changed, but fraudulent data can be written to a blockchain anytime.
Correct.
And so we still need verifiable raw data to be collected at the source. And that means that the data has to exist in multiple places and be scrutinized by many pairs of eyes. And so we, for example, even when we have an auditor going to a factory, we track that the auditor is actually in the place where they're supposed to be. Right? Before they had to use a smartphone to conduct the audit, we saw a lot of audits being completed from home or from the office. And so we recognize that very high-tech solutions are beneficial, and especially for very sophisticated players in the supply chain. But we also need to make sure that we look for bad actors at every stage, that we don't just take data that's been declared by suppliers as being true.
Got it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the floor to whomever's next.
Thank you very much, Senator Cassidy. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for making this possible with all of our schedules. I want to thank you for the hearing too. You and Ranking Member Crapo, this is a really important one. Ms. Vandenberg, I appreciated your views this morning and your work more generally on this issue. And you clarified that forced labor involves a lot of different sectors of our economy. Ms. Hughes, I appreciated what you said in your testimony about how success should be measured by reduction of forced labor. And we appreciate your company's work in that regard. I got to tell you, I was surprised last year when I saw this investigation by the New York Times on what's happening during the pandemic in Xinjiang region of China. This, of course, is where the Uyghurs are experiencing so many human rights abuses. And one is, of course, forced labor. I learned that with regard to protective equipment, PPE, there were only 4 companies prior to the pandemic that were producing PPE, yet by June that number had increased to 51 companies. 17 of those companies were known to utilize Uyghur forced labor. While not all of these were for export, I acknowledge that the principle still stands. Instead of meeting the demand for PPE with products produced by forced labor in China, what we should be doing, obviously, is incentivizing the return of PPE production to the United States. Just one more reason. And one way we can do that is by issuing these long-term contracts. What we have found is that companies in the United States, and I spoke to some as recently as yesterday, they do want to produce more product here, textiles in general, but specifically PPE, but they need to know there's going to be a market for it. And specifically, it frustrates me that our federal government will not give them long-term contracts and some predictability and some certainty. And it seems to make sense, frankly, for the US government as well. Otherwise, the reshoring is not going to occur. So in our proposal called the Make PPE in America Act, we simply add a Berry Amendment requirement to strengthen these supply chains. Mr. Rona, I'm going to turn to you because I haven't had you seen you answer a question recently. I'm sure you were busy earlier, but can you explain how doing this, diversifying supply chains and reshoring manufacturing can help reduce reliance on forced labor?
Well, I think if the government would spend some money on our factories and some investment, Globe itself has spent millions and millions and millions of dollars fighting cheap Chinese products. If they were to spend that money on our factories, they would run more efficiently and maybe we would still be open. We need some type of fair playing field to help us out. And, the country wants to go solar, wants to go green, but we're going to rely on 80% of our solar grade silicon to come from China. So then we rely on China to go green. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't know how we can let that happen. Yeah.
And it also helps with regard to forced labor in China, if we can have that PPE as an example, be made here. Right. So the general principle stands. Another issue we just talked about was this blockchain, the distributive ledger idea. And I found that a really interesting conversation with Senator Cassidy. Mr. Bonanni, I think there's an opportunity here to use artificial intelligence better. I'm co-chair of the caucus here in the Congress on this. And I led a letter with Senator Warner actually last year to Secretary Pompeo
about the AI-enabled facial recognition technology the Chinese Communist Party is using to surveil Uyghurs. And also other authoritarian regimes are increasingly using artificial intelligence. So it's certainly being used in a negative way. But I also think that artificial intelligence can play a helpful role in combating forced labor. Researchers successfully used machine learning as an example to identify fishing vessels using forced labor by recognizing patterns that were unique to those vessels. Your company uses technology in this regard. Are you interested in this? Are there forced labor signatures within supply chains? How can AI make it easier to identify those signatures which might not be readily apparent?
Absolutely. Look, I'm an MIT guy at heart, so I think of this as a fight that we have against supply chain hackers. Right? They're using modern technology to misrepresent the origins of goods to get them into the US. And we're still, in many cases, using last century's technology to monitor supply chains. And we need to bring that level of technology that we use in enforcement much higher than the hackers. It's not that sophisticated what they're doing. We just need to detect fraud. And what we do, it ranges from very simple things like making sure a farm produced the right amount to be expected for the area, to making sure that the audits are conducted blindly and with lots of supporting documentation. And all of that, you can think of it like a credit card company scanning your transactions to look for anomalies, to put up red flags early, to help companies immediately detect a problem in their supply chain months before they even receive the goods. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, those are absolutely essential to monitoring those supply chains once we have transparency.
Colleagues, can I ask
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Come on, Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this hearing. It's incredibly important. I want to ask Mrs. Vandenberg and Mr. Bonani a question in regards to what we can learn from our experiences in the trafficking world. In dealing with human trafficking, we've been able to get the global community to enact very strong laws. We talk about transparency and need to deal with supply chain and forced labor. We have strong laws dealing with trafficking. We've put resources behind those laws in order to get the facts. We do have, we don't just rely on transparency, we have capacity to know what countries are doing in regards to fighting human trafficking. And then we have global recognition through the Trafficking in Persons report as to what every country is doing in dealing with this issue. And lastly, there's consequences if you don't meet certain standards. There's consequences in regards. And I can tell you that when I meet with representatives from other countries, they know about our Trafficking in Persons report. They know how they're rated. That document has received widespread support. And of course, it gets visibility every year when the report is released. So my question to the two of you is there something we can take out of what we've been able to do with trafficking, which also deals with forced labor and trafficking in labor? Is there lessons that we can learn in order to strengthen the transparency and global cooperation in rooting out the unfair and human rights violations of forced labor?
So I would answer briefly with 2 points. One, end complicity, and two, be skeptical. Number one, it's very difficult for the United States to complain about forced labor and supply chains when the end importers of those forced labor goods are US companies, and there's no enforcement against the US companies. And Customs and Border Protection enforcement is against suppliers on the ground in other countries. So I think we need to make sure that we are holding American companies accountable for importing goods made with forced labor. One fine, one penalty is not enough. The second point I would make is skepticism. The State Department learned over time that it needed to be very skeptical about self-reporting from those countries about how many prosecutions and what enforcement they had done. They needed to be very skeptical that those countries were, for example, taking credit for work that was actually done on the ground by non-governmental organizations rather than with state funding or with state programs. That skepticism from the trafficking in persons world should be focused like a laser beam on auditors, because what we see with this, audit industrial complex is exactly what Dr. Bonani referenced: audits that are fake, audits that are bogus. I'll just give you one example to close. There was a factory that had a third-party auditor, and it was unannounced, so everything seemed utterly kosher. But when the unannounced auditor arrived at the door, the owner of the factory simply changed the music to a different song in the factory, which was the well-known sign to all the children to run out the back door. So we have to be very skeptical of what's coming in about whether or not these supply chains are clean, because the auditors are not independent.
Dr.
And I'll just, let me just add 2 points on my end. I mean, the resounding lesson of the past year has been that Customs and Border Protection sent a signal that was heard around the world with the WRO enforcement. It is leading, frankly, the world in this approach, and it has spurred a lot of companies to implement transparency, traceability, verification of their supply chains in a way that they were not doing before Customs and Border Protection. So I applaud CBP for doing this, and I think you should recognize just how powerful that signal has been to a variety of industries. And the second is the same skepticism that I want to underscore, which is with that enforcement, with that will to enforce, there needs to be a commensurate collection, analysis, verification of data that can be used to definitively prove that a supply chain is up to par, but also to definitively exclude supply chains in which there's not sufficient transparency to have the confidence that there is not forced labor, and so that we can know and companies can know exactly who to do business and who to avoid.
I would just underscore that I agree with what was said, that in the trafficking review, we review all countries, including the United States. And destination countries have strong responsibilities in regards to stopping trafficking. And we rate countries on how well they do as destination countries, not just transit countries and countries of origin. So your point is very well taken. We need that transparency, and we need enforcement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this.
Thank my colleague very much. I see our friend Senator Crapo back. I believe there are no further members, Senator Crapo, and I thought I would deliver perhaps a 2-minute wrap up of the week. Is there anything that you would like to say at this point?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this was a very needed hearing and a very helpful hearing, and I look forward to your wrap up comments.
And I would only say that today these are exceptionally serious issues with respect to China's use of forced labor. It poses a threat to Chinese workers, American workers like Mr. Rona, but it also is going to affect our ability to address the climate crisis in a meaningful and expeditious way. And to that end, I'd like to introduce for the record 2 articles addressing concerns with the use of forced labor in polysilicon and solar panels. Without objection, so ordered. Let me, if I might, and I see Senator Crapo here. I've been struck, this week, we've had 3 hearings in the Senate Finance Committee, boosting American manufacturing to get more high-skill, high-wage jobs for our people, improving nursing home, urgent business after the national tragedy there of the last year, and now the question of ending forced labor so we can protect workers like Mr. Rona, who spelled out exactly what happened when he lost his job as a result of forced labor. And what runs through all of the work we did this week is the need for more good paying jobs in America, health and safety, critical issues for our workers and our well-being, and transparency and fair treatment. And particularly when Senator Crapo is here, I want to note we have had exceptional participation by Democrats and Republicans all week long when there were a lot of activities going on here. And I regard this as a good sign. I think there's a lot of what we've discussed this week that can be tackled in a bipartisan way, and colleagues working together, starting with the semiconductor issue, which those memory chips drive everything as it relates to the way we live. So this has been a great panel and really a very important week. Questions for the record on today's hearing are due next Friday, March 26th by close of business. And I thank our guests, and you gave us in this third session a lot of very constructive ideas about, again, what we need to do in this country to strengthen the ability of Americans to get high skill, high wage jobs. And we can do it in a bipartisan way. With that, the Finance Committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.